Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a visual archive of what has to be one of the most sweeping, deliberate transformations of a human landscape in modern history. We're unpacking the human story behind an absolute engineering marvel, the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River. But we aren't focusing on the concrete and the turbines today. No, we're looking at what had to be completely erased to make room for it. So let's take a journey into a deliberately drowned river civilization.
I really want you to picture the reality beneath the surface for a second. Somewhere under 175 meters of water, there are actual villages. And I don't mean ancient, long-abandoned ruins, right? I'm talking about modern, living villages. There are streets down there where children played, markets where farmers sold their vegetables, and ancient temples where families prayed for literally 1,000 years. There are stone bridges that connected communities across the river for centuries. And all of it, the whole shebang, is underwater now.
1.4 million. That is the sheer scale of the erasure we're talking about here. That is the number of people erased from their ancestral lands. By any measure, this represents the single largest forced population transfer for an infrastructure project in human history. To really wrap our heads around this, we need to break down exactly what a number like that looks like on the map. First, 13 major urban centers. We're talking entire cities, each with their own localized economies, their own infrastructure, their own unique histories, all systematically wiped off the map just to prepare for the rising reservoir.
But it wasn't just the huge cities, of course. 140 established towns were also completely or partially swallowed by the waters. These were regional hubs of trade and community life right along the middle Yangtze, which, by the way, happens to be one of the oldest continuously inhabited river corridors on planet Earth. And finally, the micro-communities, 1,350 villages. It is so easy to just get lost in the macro data of 1.4 million people, but this number right here, 1,350, really grounds us in the devastating loss of thousands of tight-knit, multi-generational communities, each one representing a distinct cultural fingerprint that is just gone forever.
When we look at the historical photographic record of all this, the scenes are incredibly haunting. Before the water ever even arrived, there was a systematic, massive demolition. Buildings were methodically stripped all the way down to their bare foundations, leaving endless miles of rubble just piled along the riverbanks. It was a highly planned, decade-long mechanical process of erasing an entire civilization to prepare the river basin.
Section 1. The logistics of erasure. So how exactly do you move over 1 million people away from the highly fertile riverbanks they've known for generations? Well, this massive relocation process kicked off in the mid-1990s and took well over a decade to complete. And there was a very stark contrast between what was promised on paper and the catastrophic reality on the ground. A lot of residents were moved up to 1,000 kilometers away, to places like Hebei province. Now, while the compensation packages might have looked adequate officially, the reality was often substandard urban apartments far, far away from their established family networks. Farmers ended up with inferior, rocky hillside farmland with super thin soil. And to make matters worse, endemic corruption meant that missing funds, phantom housing allocations, and wildly inflated construction costs were just a persistent everyday reality.
Section 2. The generation divide.
The impact of this massive displacement did not fall evenly at all. To truly understand this visual record, we have to look at the human toll through the lens of age. For the elderly, this relocation meant absolute devastation. They suffered a profound cultural grief. They lost the community they'd lived in their entire lives, often becoming virtually invisible in new cities where they sometimes spoke a completely different dialect. On the flip side, working-age adults faced a really bitter irony. Their highly specialized skills, like farming, fishing, and river navigation, were completely useless in the concrete urban environments where they were resettled, and that led to mass unemployment. Though it should absolutely be noted that some of the younger generations did genuinely benefit from new access to urban schools and modern healthcare.
Section 3. The archaeology of loss. The Yangtze corridor contained rich evidence of human habitation stretching back thousands of years. So what happened to all of that history when the water actually began to rise? The government did authorize a massive 505 million yuan salvage effort. They excavated 723 sites, and get this, in some cases, they were dismantling massive ancient stone bridges piece by piece just to move them to reconstruction parks. They recovered about 200,000 artifacts, which included 13,000 notable treasures. And some sites, like the famous hanging coffins that are wedged right into the cliff faces, survived simply because they sit safely above the new waterline. But despite these massive efforts, it simply wasn't enough to save a whole civilization's footprint.
Which brings us to a really critical concept here, the stratigraphic record.
These are the physical layers of human history naturally compressed into the soil and rock over millennia. Once the reservoir filled, it permanently erased this unrecoverable archaeological evidence. We know for a fact that 200,000 artifacts were saved, but it prompts this incredibly haunting question. How many millions of unaccounted artifacts were lost to the water forever, simply because nobody could count what they couldn't recover?
Section 4, Wanzhou, the visual record.
In Wanzhou, which was a really vibrant city of over 1 million people, the deliberate destruction was just stark. Between 2002 and 2005, world-renowned photographers like Edward Bertinsky, Mouge, and Zheng Nan documented Wanzhou being systematically reduced to construction waste. They captured a stunning, yet incredibly eerie visual archive of a city literally being unbuilt. Yet, when you compare this to sudden natural disasters that instantly dominate global news, the deliberate, planned submersion of these 1,000 Chinese communities generated almost no sustained international attention, as the reservoir filled between 2003 and 2010.
Section 5. The 4 million question.
Now, the story doesn't actually end when the dam was completed. There remains a massive, unresolved issue regarding the dam's continuing human toll. Back in 2007, reports emerged of an additional 4 million planned relocations from the Chongqing area. Now, officially, the government cited general urbanization, but the geographical reality tells a much different story. These 4 million people were located exactly where the reservoir's effects were most severe. They were facing massive landslides, entirely unstable hillsides, degraded water quality, and completely ruined farmland. The social networks that were severed in the 90s just continued to be disrupted decades later.
Section 6, the final calculus.
Ultimately, we are forced to weigh two opposing forces here. The mathematical defense is harsh, for sure, but it is objectively defensible. Displace roughly 1 million people to protect 100 million people downstream from catastrophic, deadly flooding. But that calculus completely fails to capture the unquantifiable loss. You can catalog the buildings, you can count the recovered artifacts, but you absolutely cannot quantify the loss of daily rhythms, seasonal festivals, and the generational texture of human life along the Middle Yangtze.
You simply can't excavate belonging. Concrete apartments and cash payments, even in the cases where they aren't siphoned off by corruption, they simply cannot replace the soul of a community that existed in complete harmony with a river for a millennium. Once it's drowned, it is gone.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought to end our explainer today. Looking at the visual record of this massive, calculated erasure, does the world owe these forgotten underwater communities more recognition? I really want to know what you think about this calculus. Let me know, and definitely be sure to join us for our next explainer, where we're going to be looking at the physical structure of the dam itself and the hidden cracks that are just starting to show. See you there.